Survivor Rhetoric, the rhetoric of sexual violence. In my project, I studied the rhetoric from survivors of sexual violence. Survivor rhetoric is worthy of studying because the mere existence of survivor rhetoric means that a survivor has had to overcome the systemic and cultural barriers that have been systematically laid out to prevent that survivor from disclosing their trauma to others. In my project, I explore the existing academic rhetorical studies based on survivor rhetoric, and I apply these principles to a case study. The case study analyzes an event that happened on my own university just this past spring. In my research, I've found that many universities actually have been the site of anti-rape culture protests. Many of these protests have taken the form of rape lists. What a rape list is essentially a list posted anonymously, often on a public restroom stall or somewhere on an on-campus facade, that makes public accusations of sexual assault, rape, by naming the accused on the lists. However, the group, known as #ChangeRapeCulture, took the concept of rape lists and pushed it a little further. They added faces to the people who were making these accusations, rather than doing it anonymously. From the very few responses that they received, and the few of them that were negative, cited that this was a lack of due process, and this was an affront to our justice system. What these people are referring to is the doctrine of innocent until proven guilty. What this doctrine really means is that the people who make the accusations carry the burden of proof, meaning they have to prove that the crime did happen. For survivors of sexual assault, and for the few of those survivors who go to the police to report their trauma, the burden of proof is incredibly heavy. Survivors have to go through invasive and uncomfortable processes that include rape kits and testimonies that force survivors to relive their trauma. And that's why studying the rhetoric of survivors is incredibly important, because it has been historically and systemically difficult for survivors to disclose their trauma and seek justice. This is a form of silencing survivors from disclosing their testimonies. There are also more factors that contribute to debilitating survivors from disclosing their trauma. One of the biggest factors are social stigmas, or rape myths. These rape myths attempt to divert the blame from perpetrators of sexual violence onto the survivors. A popular rape myth is to blame a woman for what she was wearing, as if her clothes had anything to do with the crimes committed against her, or the myth that women continually lie about sexual violence. What these myths serve to do is to preserve the hegemonic and patriarchal structures in our society. Therefore, when survivors break their silence with their survivor rhetoric, what they're doing is actually countercultural to the patriarchal values of society today. In my work, I analyze the academic conversations surrounding survivor rhetoric. All of the scholars that I've studied do not contend the sources of these social and systemic prejudices against survivors. What survivors are doing is slowly regaining agency from their very traumatic experiences. In fact, the subject of agency in sexual assault survivors is a hot topic among scholars. The overarching debate is whether to acknowledge sexual assault survivors as survivors or as victims. The classic feminist debate is that the term victim is devoid of agency and is almost objectified. The term survivor is largely favored by scholars. The term is more agentive, and it restores the agency that was stripped from them and is continually stripped from them from both the event and the trauma that they continually endure. One of the scholars I've studied, Rebecca Stringer, analyzes the victim versus survivor debate. Stringer essentially argues that this debate is only a perpetuation of neoliberal values. Neoliberalism, as an economic and social system, praises personal individual agency. We see neoliberalism all the time. In fact, there are hints of neoliberalism in rape myths, especially rape myths that question a woman's agency in the wake of an act of sexual violence, as if a survivor's clothing or actions could thwart an unwanted sexual act. Stringer argues that the fierce feminist conviction of anti-victimhood is actually reflecting neoliberal values. Although Stringer argues these aren't neoliberal feminists, but these feminist values are starting to overlay with neoliberal values. Therefore, we are reinforcing gender scripts and harmful rape myths that praise agentive survivors over victims, and we run the risk of delegitimizing trauma. In the case study of the protests that happened on campus, there was a group called #ChangeRapeCulture. The protest involved members of the group holding up signs that had names and blood splatter and the words allegedly printed onto these posters. There wasn't a lot of context as to who these names were and what were they being accused of, but it was pretty evident that since they were being held by members of a group that protested rape culture, that these men were being accused of sexual violence. The protesters' twist on the rapeless strategy took away the anonymity of the strategy. What the protesters are doing, essentially, is they're trading in their victimhood for their survivorship. They are proving that they are agentive and willing to confront head-on the processes in the justice system that make it incredibly hard for survivors of sexual assault to come forward. What this protest really does, and what the media missed entirely, is that the protesters restored their agency, a coveted virtue in a neoliberal time. So they took matters into their own hands and made public accusations. To be agentless is to be silent, and these survivors are breaking their silence with agency.